Top 5 ways to get better at fixing your car. Top 10 best books by so-and-so. I don't know what it is about those articles. You can disagree with me if you want. You're wrong, but they're just, I don't know what it is. They're just kind of polarizing. 5 proven methods to improve your workout routine, whatever it may be. And I think most of the time those kind of articles are in like the self-help category, but I think I'd like to take that sort of idea, like a top 10 or 3 keys or whatever. And the title for our lesson this evening is to sort of flip that around. 3 keys to being a worthless person is the title of our lesson this evening. I'm not joking, that really is what the title of the lesson is. 3 keys to being a worthless person. 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verses 12 through 17 is going to be the text we'll use to talk about that. 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verses 12 through 17. He would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up the priest would take for himself. Thus they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat from you, only raw." If the man said to him, "They must surely burn the fat first, and then take as much as you desire," then he would say, "No, but you shall give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. Now we're going to kind of dissect this story a little bit this evening, but here are the 3 keys to being a worthless person. 3 of them for you this evening. Number 1, disregard authority. Number 2, be greedy and selfish. Number 3, don't listen. So let's kind of unpack the first one. I guess sort of the first question that you probably need to ask whenever you talk about this text is, how in the world did Eli's sons even disregard authority? I mean, it's all kind of confusing, isn't it? Thrusting this fork down in the pot and bringing it up, what is all this about and what's going on? Why is there any kind of problem here? And really, all that has to do with is procedure. Eli's sons are priests. They have names. Hophni and Phinehas are their names, as chapter 1 and verse 3 mentions. Now, just a reference for you that you can write down. We won't go there this evening because Terry's already giving me a hard time about the lesson being long. But Leviticus chapter 7 and verses 31 through 35 is the text that you'd want to use. And I'll just give you a rundown of what it's talking about right there. The priests only had a certain amount apportioned to them. They were only allowed to take the breast of the animal and the right thigh of the animal. That was their portion. The fat portions of the animal, you could not hang on to those. Those were dedicated to God. Those would have been burned on the altar. Now, Eli's sons, what they had done right here is they actually disregarded that whole procedure. Did you notice that? They just stick the fork in the big pot, and whatever they pull out is theirs, whether or not it's from the breast or if it's from the thigh or something else. In effect, what they're doing is stealing from God. Now, did you notice that even whenever people confronted them about it, saying, "Whoa, time out, you're supposed to burn the fat," they would, of course, balk against that. And at the same time, they would steal from the people because more than likely they would have gotten portions that belonged to other people. Now, whether or not it was willful or whether or not it was ignorant, I think it's kind of a combination of the two. Willful ignorance. They disregarded God's authority right here. Thus, the result, of course, is a sinful situation. Now, certainly, this is something that I believe contributed to them being called what they are here in the text, worthless. Because not only would it affect their status before God, but it also affect their status before others. They're supposed to be the leaders in Israel, but yet they go and steal from other people, and they steal from God at the same time. They're the crooks in Israel, aren't they? Now, historically speaking, we've seen what happens when people disregard the authority of God. Nadab and Abihu, Uzzah, 2 Samuel chapter 6, reach out his hand, you remember, to touch the ark, struck down right then and there. You think about Galatians chapter 1 and verses 6 through 9. Maybe that's the reason why we have passages like that. If we or an angel from heaven preach to you any other gospel than that which you have received, let him be accursed. It's really the idea that's given in Galatians chapter 1 and verses 6 through 9. Definitely God is serious about His word then, and He's serious about His word now. Thus, to change it, or to disregard His authority in any way, would of course be a blatant disrespect of Him. Now, in fact, I think you could even take it a little bit further with this. I don't even think that it's looked upon positively whenever we disregard the authority of human laws as well. Now, I always like to say when a human law contradicts God's law, of course we don't have to be subservient to it, but generally speaking, we're supposed to be. Romans chapter 13 and verse 1, we're supposed to be subject to the governing authorities. Remember, Mark chapter 12 and verse 17, Jesus said very clearly, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. In other words, pay your taxes if that's what's required of you. So tax season's coming up, brethren. So don't say I didn't preach about that. And I think one of the reasons why we have these kind of standards laid down in His Word is because He wants us, generally speaking, to be people who respect authority. Because most people who disrespect authority, I don't know if you've looked into people's lives like that, most of the time they end up being a little bit like Eli's sons. But it's amazing when we really have that kind of respect and regard, how much more valuable we really become. So here we have some men that are stealing, they're disregarding God's authority, they had the law, yet they weren't doing it. So if you'd like to be considered in the same manner as Eli's sons, here's the first key, or if we would like that, disregard or disrespect authority, that gets you on the fast track. Now here's the next key. I hope we're paying attention because this one's really important, it's essential. Key number 2, if you want to be like Eli's sons, considered worthless, be a selfish and greedy person. Surefire way for you to be that way. Now, did you notice something as I was reading the text? These guys that we're dealing with are incredibly selfish people. When the priest servant would come around to collect, he would say something to the effect of, well, I'm not going to take the boiled meat from you. I'm only going to really take the raw. That's what I want. You see, they want the meat in this specific way. And you notice that he says he wanted it roasted. That was the way that they would have had it. Again, reflection of whatever was given to them was not good enough. Now, if somebody were to object to that, in the text you see something very clearly. Verse 16, it says, no, but you will give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. In other words, if you're not going to give me what I want, I'm just going to get it anyway. So you might as well go ahead and give it to me. Selfish people. Flagrant disrespect there, and also they're teaching God's people to more than likely have some animosity toward them. What a cutthroat approach to life they have. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting. I read something from a preacher this week that I found quite enlightening, that maybe had something to do with this idea of them sticking the fork down in and just pulling out what they wanted. You see, if there was only one portion of the animal that was designated to you, sometimes that portion is not the most ideal portion. Now, I don't know much about what makes meat so great in one place and not so great in other places. The most knowledge I have of that comes from my brother-in-law back there. But I noticed there are some cuts of meat that are generally better speaking. Backstrap, right? People generally like that more higher quality meat. And what I'm thinking, or at least the mind behind this preacher who mentioned this, basically said, well, if he really didn't want the cuts of meat that he got. So in other words, this was a way, if they would have just stuck the fork down and they would have pulled that up, they would have gotten whatever came up. So that could be more than just the breast or the thigh. It could be some of these greater cuts of meat that they would have maybe liked better or maybe been more flavorful. I don't know. But if that's the truth, I think it'd be interesting, and it certainly would contribute to the fact that these guys were selfish people. That's who they were. Now the best and the most valuable people in life don't focus so much on themselves, as did Eli's sons. In fact, they focus on God and others. Look at James chapter 3 and verses 13 through 16 with me. James chapter 3 and verses 13 through 16. James chapter 3 and verses 13 through 16. Here's a text about wisdom. And it's James comparing two different kinds of wisdom, worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. And particularly in verses 14 through 16, he describes the type of things that are never going to make a person wise. And of course we know wise and understanding people are more valuable. Notice what verses 14 through 16 or 13 through 16 says. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes from above, but it is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. I want to focus on that phrase, selfish ambition. It's another word that can be translated as strife or contentiousness. It has to do with somebody who has a party spirit. And he says the source of selfish ambition, or what you primarily see with Eli's sons at least, self-centered type people, he says the source that comes is from the earth. It's natural. It's demonic, as opposed to spiritual, godly. So when a person has that sort of thing in their heart, he says the result that only comes from that is two things: disorder and every evil thing. Now, disorder means unruliness. Does that sound a little bit like Eli's sons? Every evil thing can also be translated worthlessness or good for nothingness. Eli's sons, ladies and gentlemen. So, the second key, if a person truly wants to be like Eli's sons, wants to carry that distinction, the second thing is very clearly just be selfish. Now here's the third and final one this evening. If you really, really want to be like Eli's sons, you want to carry that distinction, don't listen. Now there's a part of the story that I didn't read for brevity's sake, but that was the outcome of the whole thing. You see, Eli is eventually going to confront his boys. And they're not only stealing from people, they're not only just greedy and disregarding God's authority, but they're also men who like to sleep around as well. Now, I want you to notice what finally happens. Verses 22 through 25 of that same chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 2. Verses 22 through 25 says this. Now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel and how they lay with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He said to them, "Why do you do such things, the evil things that I hear from all these people? No, my sons, for the report is not good which I hear the Lord's people circulating. If one man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. There's no doubt why he's questioning them. They've certainly gone too far. And can you imagine how disappointing it was for Eli to hear something like that? And the final outcome is that no one can really intercede for them. They've sinned against God. But the problem ultimately is found in verse 25. They don't listen. And if a person's unwilling to listen, what can you really do? Now some of this is on Eli, because God actually ends up coming to Eli. In verse 29, you find that he honored his sons above the Lord. Apparently showed them some sort of preferential treatment. Regardless, though, when the rubber really met the road and they were confronted about it, it still doesn't change the fact that the sons didn't listen to what they really needed to hear at the time. And how many people, brethren, have followed in the path of Eli's sons because they have been completely unwilling to listen? I've certainly had those failures in my life. My parents had something good and valuable to tell me, and I just wasn't ever listening, didn't take it seriously, and ended up paying for that. You know, in 1 John chapter 4 and verses 1 through 6, John had to deal with some false teaching that was coming up in the area. And really, the idea of the false teaching, or what was being thrown around at that time, was people were disregarding Jesus Christ as being God in the flesh. And in order to deal with this very problem, an early form of what we call Gnosticism, John gives these Christians a test that they can give. Here's one of the tests, verse 6. 1 John 4:6, "For we are from God. He who knows God listens to us. He who is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error." Did you notice that? One of the tests for a genuine person was someone that was willing to listen to the apostles. They were speaking God's word, and therefore to listen to them was, of course, to listen to God. And an unwillingness by us to listen to Him, I believe, is to pick the path of Eli's sons. So if we want to be like Eli's sons and carry that same distinction that they have, worthless, I know it's a tough thing that they're being called here. Well, just do what they did. Disregard authority, be selfish, and don't listen. But if we want to be valuable, full of worth, respect authority, be selfless, and listen. If you're here and you need the prayers of the congregation, please come at this time while together we stand and sing.